So the book that I chose for my final presentation was The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about her because I think her life is actually really interesting. She is a Canadian poet, novelist, literary critic, essayist, teacher, environmental activist, and an inventor. She is a very accomplished woman who was born in the year 1939. Since the year 1961, she has been a published author, and she has published 18 books of poetry, 18 novels, 11 books of nonfiction, and a lot of other things, including children's books and 2 graphic novels and 9 collections of short fiction. I think her work is really interesting. Her most known work is the book I'm gonna talk about, The Handmaid's Tale, but I think all of her books are really interesting because all of her work encompass a variety of themes, including gender and identity, religion and myth, the power of language, climate change, and the power of politics. Now, like I said previously, her most well-known book is The Handmaid's Tale, and I think it's really interesting, this book, because this book was published in 1985, and she says that she was inspired on Orwell's book 1984, but she wanted to make a dystopia, like to imagine what a dystopia would look like for women. She said, and I'm gonna quote here, "The majority of dystopias, Orwell's included, have been written by men and the point of view has been male. When women have appeared in them, they have either been sexless automations or rebels who've defied the sex rule of the regime." She wanted to imagine what the dystopia would imply for women, what would be their new role in society, and how they would be affected. And while doing research to get inspiration for this book, I'm gonna quote again. She had a lot of paper in her office, and some co-workers of hers said, here's the quote, "There were stories of abortion and contraception being outlawed in Romania, and reports from Canada lamenting its falling birth rate, and articles from the US about Republican attempts to withhold federal funding from clinics that provided abortion services." She was inspired by real-life events, real things going on in the world, to imagine what would be the role of women in a dystopia and what would a dystopia be for women. She has stated that she didn't invent, she didn't make up any of the control mechanisms that are seen in the book and are described in her book. All of that has been taken from things in history, either things that were currently going on by the time she wrote the book, or things in history that had been going on from all around the world. And this has kept being true even for the series adaptation. There is a series of the book, and the creators of the show said that they wanted to respect this, and even in the show, everything that they represent, or at least most of what they represent, are things that have happened previously in history. And I thought this was really interesting because there are some really gruesome things and some really horrible things that are being portrayed with these control mechanisms of this new society that the book represents, that I will talk about in a little bit. And I just think it's pretty crazy to see that all of those are things that are based on reality. It just kept me thinking how we as humans behave when we have power, and how crazy it is that's just that the fact that so little people, like such a small group of people, have such an immense amount of power can mean so many things, like a radical change in the lives of most of society. Now that I've stated a little bit about the author, I'm gonna explain a little bit about the plot of the book to give a little context. So the book takes place in a future dystopic United States. It all starts with an infertility crisis that was caused by pollution and chemical waste. After the declining birth rates, a lot of people were very concerned and alarmed of what this would imply for society, and a group of rebels that called themselves the Sons of Jacob, which is a religious extremist group, they one day they massacred the president of the United States. Like, they just went off and killed him, and they installed a new provisional, allegedly, government, um, in which they would take over while everything regained control again, like while the country stabilized again. However, they overthrew their constitution and they began taking a lot of power. One of the first things they did was that state that every woman had to be fired from their previous jobs, and they froze every woman's bank account. Also, they didn't have access to own property, so they depended on the closest man in their life. Obviously, this started a lot of riots and a lot of protests in the country. A lot of people was against this, but this group started a lot of persecutions and started with a lot of violence, responded to a lot of violence, and so people just had to kind of accept that they were in control now. So with this in mind, our story centers on our main character, who is called Offred. She is a handmaid, and in this new society, a handmaid is a woman who is assigned to bear children for elite couples that have trouble conceiving. Offred serves the commander and his wife Serena Joy. Now, I think it's important to state now that once the sons of Jacob took over the government, they installed a new class system, in which the men were on the top, obviously, and the commanders were the founders of Gilead, which is the new name they gave to the United States. Now, regarding the women, a handmaid, as I stated previously, are the women that were kept fertile, and their only job was to bear children. And the wives, even though they were elite, they had to just keep company to the husbands. All of the women were restricted, like everything they had to do, but especially women were casted into different class systems, depending on how useful they could be for the men. And so, as we said, we have the wives and the handmaids, but we also have the martas, that are the housekeepers, and the aunts, which are the women who have to train the handmaids. So, to fulfill her duties every month when she is in the right point of her menstrual cycle, Offred, which is important to state, is not her real name. All of the handmaids' names are formed with Off and then the name of the commander they serve. So in her case, is Offred. But anyways, to fulfill her duties every month, she must have ritualized sex with the commander and his wife. This is done in a very creepy way, but basically the commander has sex with her. The wife sits behind Offred and holds her hands. This is to kind of symbolize that the wife is part of the process, and the children is actually her and not Offred's, because she will have to give the baby away to the couple. So like it stated, the freedom of Offred, like every other woman, is completely restricted. Men have, in the case of Offred, his commander has complete control over what she reads and what she does. Women are not allowed to read. They're not allowed to go outside alone, and it is a very sad reality to live in. And it is important to state that before Gilead, before everything happened, Offred had an affair with a man named Luke. Luke then divorced his, at the time, wife to get married to Offred, and they had a child together. However, after she was captured, she was separated from her family. Her marriage was pretty much denied, because since Luke was a divorced man, and the Sons of Jacob, the new government, is an extreme religious group, they said that was not approved by God. And then Offred was sent to a re-education center where the women of Gilead were indoctrinated and were prepared to become handmaids. Now, when Offred was allowed to go to the shop to buy things for the house, she was accompanied by another handmaid who was called Offglen. And eventually, Offglen reveals that she was a member of an organization called the Mayday, which purpose was to overthrow Gilead. Now, after Ofglen revealed this information to Offred, she begs her to and asks her to recollect information from the commander that could be useful. However, Offred is not really she doesn't really keep in mind this because she begins an affair with the chauffeur of Serena and the commander, which is called Nick. Now, this affair started because actually Serena and the doctor that Offred had to visit every month to make sure that everything was in control and that she was still fertile, revealed to her that the commander was actually not fertile, but this couldn't had to be kept secret because this could ruin the reputation of the commander, and the couple had to have a child one way or another. So Serena proposes to Offred that she has an affair with Nick so that she could get pregnant and that she can pass her child as being of the commander. However, it's important to state that Serena promised Offred to give her a picture of her daughter if she agrees, which just makes us as the audience realize that all of this time Serena knows where Offred's daughter is. And this is what makes her ultimately agree to the affair with Nick. But the night that they were supposed to have their first encounter, the commander takes Offred to a nightclub called Jezebel's. Now, this was also like a secret escape. Serena had no idea this was gonna happen. Now, however, she eventually finds out and she tells Offred that they will be punished. This is really scary because the way that women were punished in the society, well, both women and men could be punished. However, for the women, they were sent to clean toxic waste, and this was very hard manual labor, and this affected their health. And pretty much, this was something that no one wanted to do because it was pretty much guaranteed death. You stopped being basically a member of society. And for the men, they also had other forms of punishment, including death. The women could also be hanged if they did some activity that was against the system. So Offred is thinking that the military that is now called the Eye is gonna take her away. However, when she sees a van of the military approaching to take her away, Nick comes in and tells her that that van is not really from the military, but is people from the Mayday members who have come to save her, and Offred lives with them. This is pretty much where we finish Offred's story, and we're never gonna know for sure if she was actually saved and Nick didn't lie to her, or if she was taken to be imprisoned or probably sent to her death. And this is kind of the point that Margaret Atwood wanted to make. This is just a story, a brief segment of a person's life in this new dystopic future, but even though we want the happy ending, we cannot be promised the happy ending. And it's just really interesting that she decided to end the book this way. Like after Offred's story finishes, there is we go in the future after Gilead disappears, after the Gilead system is overthrown, and we go to a kind of a lecture that is giving a university professor, and he states that they found segments of Offred's life on cassettes, like on recordings, and her life has been used as an example to explain what the women suffered in this system. He says that he believes that Offred was safe. However, he doesn't know what happened after she was saved by the Mayday. Maybe she could flee the country, maybe she was recaptured. We will never know. Now, regarding my analysis and my ideas and conclusions from the book, I actually want to touch on a few different topics because I think that the book touches different subjects, different subjects, and proposes a lot of interesting ideas and discussions about each one of them. And the first thing I want to talk about is the feminine dystopia that Margaret Atwood proposes. I never realized that most dystopias that we know are from a man's point of view and emphasizing a lot in the role of men in this new society. However, it was really interesting to see that women were given like status in this new society based on how useful they were. And in terms of usefulness, to put it that way, it's really interesting to see that the value that they were given depended on how fertile they were. I think that this questions a lot of what is the role of women even in today's society, like what do we perceive as value for women. And it's interesting to see how they were pitted against each other and divided into all of these groups. It is a lot about how valuable they are for the men, not even for themselves. They weren't even allowed to do things like read anymore because that was not useful for men. The handmaid's work was very clear. They were supposed to just birth babies. However, the other like social classes that I didn't mention in my summary of the book are also really interesting, and it's really interesting because they were very separated even from their clothing. The handmaids had to wear long red dresses, while, for example, the aunts, which were the women who indoctrinated them, since they were in power, they had more masculine like uniforms. And I just think it's really interesting because this reminded me a little bit of the relationship, especially between the wives and the handmaids, reminded me of something that is called the Madonna horror complex. Basically, the Madonna horror complex is a way to categorize women into two different groups. You have the Madonnas, which are the women who are sensible, who are sorry for my cat, who are like respectable women, who are women we want to be mothers and wives, but we do not sexualize them or see them as sex objects. However, the whores, and sorry for the word, but they are women who are open about their sexuality, but not women that traditionally men would want to marry or have as mothers or fulfill these very traditional values and roles. And this is something that is constantly going on in The Handmaid's Tale. The handmaids are seen as sex objects by the commanders and the men, and nothing more. They cannot even be mothers of the child they give birth to. They don't have that right. And the Madonnas, or the wives in this case, are only seen as companions for the commanders, and however, not like sexualized women. They are not really, the commanders generally don't even want to have sex with them. So I think it's really interesting how we can see tropes of dynamics between women that are going on still on today's society, reflected on the book. And I don't know, this is something that I think that is really relevant nowadays, maybe just even more important than it was when the book was originally written. And another thing that I want to talk about is our freedom. Are we taking our freedom for granted? This was the question that I kept thinking while reading the book, and I know it sounds maybe a little bit exaggerated, but the book does a really great job at showing us how a dystopia comes to be, like how a dystopia is created. The book explains how it was just the United States we know nowadays, and how little by little all of these events took place, and now it's this dystopic, chaotic future in which women have no rights in our control, then all of these horrible things happen. And I don't know, like, even just remembering that everything comes from reality, is inspired on maybe real events, just they get me thinking if we're taking our freedom for granted, like how aware are we of how the government has forms to control us and what we do and what we think. And hopefully, I think so, we're not gonna get to the point of Gilead, but we can get to maybe a dystopic future, and we're not even realizing it. We're not realizing everything that's going on in the political climate, in the environmental climate that could lead to a future that maybe we don't like. Also, finally, I think it's really interesting that the group that took over the government, the Sons of Jacob, was made to be a religious group. This proposes the question, like, how far can we go in the name of God, or rather, how far have we gone already in our current world, in the name of God. Now, I don't have anything about against people who believe in God, who are Christians, who manifest their religion and their faith. But when this is taken to an extreme and you justify a lot of really bad things with, oh, it's because it's God's will, or it's in the Bible, but it's taken in the most literal way, or with no interpretation or a passage out of context, it's really interesting to see how much of a valuable argument apparently that is nowadays. And I think that it's not something that is that crazy or that out of the ordinary. This has happened already, like not obviously something at the level of The Handmaid's Tale, but we have had religious figures and religious leaders do terrible things in the name of God, just from going back in history with things like the Inquisition, things of like in the terms of colonization, when all of the indigenous people from America, for example, were killed and were taught to not follow up their customs because they were not of the religion of the colonizers. Even to nowadays, where people, for example, are homophobic and do horrible acts of violence against other people in the name of God, in the name of, oh, that's not in the Bible. And I think this is also a reflection that is important to make, because once again, it's not obviously to this extreme, hopefully it's never gonna get to that extreme, but it's important to be aware of how religion can be a form of manipulation and a form of control. And I don't know, the book just does a really great job at showing us how this can be done in a very effective way. And yes, just to summarize, I really enjoyed this book. I think it proposes a lot of ideas that are still relevant nowadays. And I think this is a very interesting story that has a lot of things to keep you thinking about. I know I have been thinking about topics discussed in the book for days now. And I just really enjoyed this lecture, and I think that even though it's fiction, it is a fiction that is a reflection of our values nowadays and things that are current events nowadays. And I just think it was really interesting to see this in this form.